Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm joined by Dr. Eshana Bragg, who is an ecopsychologist with over 30 years of experience in her field. Her research focuses on the psychological relationships between people and nature and includes investigating the psychological benefits of experiences in nature, the concept of the ecological self or ecological identity, and the efficacy of environmental programs and the influence of sense of place on action for sustainability. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Eshana Bragg.
Hi, Xavier. It's lovely to be here.
Brilliant. Well, look, I think as everyone, I think most people have their own stories, and so it's an interesting place where you've ended up and what you're currently doing. So I'd love to learn a little bit about your story. How did you arrive at the place you are today, and what interests you in ecopsychology?
Okay, great. Thanks, Xavier. So where I'd actually like to start is the place that I am today. So I want to start by explaining that I'm on this call on Yagle country in northern New South Wales beside Birrenbar, mighty Clarence River. And I want to acknowledge the elders, the custodians of this place, their wisdom and what they've done to care for this place, their survival in terms of their culture and strength, and what they've managed to pass on to me. So I'm very grateful. Where I am is actually inside like a little hidden valley inside McLean Hill, and we're on 25 acres of regenerating rainforest. In a small community, I live with my long-term partner, Pete. I teach ecopsychology and action for social change at university, and we do some of that here at Forest Haven. We're also part of a group of people creating an eco village next door. So there's 3 households here already, 11 coming up. That's called Jagira Eco Community. And I'm part of a collective of practitioners called the Joyality Project. So that for me feels like a picture of where I'm at right now. So my story, how did I get here? Again, I'd love to start in a fairly unusual place, which is recognizing that my story starts way before I was born, millions of years ago, in deep time. So just acknowledging that I and all of us from the stardust, it's probably billions of years ago, and just acknowledging all my ancestors. So everything from the bacteria through to the fish, through to the primates, all my ancestors through my human ancestors. To now. Most of my ancestors, all of my ancestors were from England, and I was born in England and came out to Australia when I was 6. I think this is where, for me, a lot of my ecopsychology story really begins, personally speaking. Coming to Australia was a fairly traumatic social experience, and I was lucky enough to come to Sydney, and where we lived was in the bush on the side of the harbour. And so while it was socially scary and dislocating and traumatic, the bush and the sea became my kind of confidants, my best friends, a real source of nurturing and nourishment, even when I was like a little girl. So that was a key point in my story. I remember being in high school, becoming suddenly aware that like this seemingly pristine environment, which was actually riddled with pollution. I think it was like a high school project. And I remember, being 14, 15 and recognizing how bizarre it was that nobody seemed to be talking about this, and that nobody seemed to care, and no one seemed to know. And so that spurred me on to, I sort of started to realize that what I wanted to do was to really reawaken people's sense of wonder in nature, as well as actually getting them activated to protect nature and make a difference. So I went on to university and did ecology and psychology as double majors, because I kind of figured out the problems weren't actually with the environment, they were with people. So, that was why I enjoyed like studying psychology. And right at the end of my university degree, I think it was like the last 3 weeks of university, I discovered inside social ecology there was this small field called environmental psychology. And I was so thrilled that there were these other people who also saw that interconnection. So from there, I was another really pivotal moment was that I experienced a deep ecology workshop. So we're talking like 1988 here. So I was like 23. And I went to Confest, which, for those of you who don't know, is like a fabulous like hippie festival that is still going on on the borders of New South Wales and Victoria. And there I got to participate in a deep ecology workshop, which is facilitated by John Seed. And I also met a whole tribe of people who were part of the Rainforest Information Centre, it was called, but basically a whole bunch of really passionate activists. And doing that workshop, I remember both feeling like, oh, I'd really found my calling, because this actually was the real environmental psychology. The academic form was really dry and research-based, but this deep ecology was actually a group of people connecting with nature, connecting with each other, and going deep in terms of their feelings about what was going on. So, so that was kind of the start of what I do now. And I went on to do an honours degree and a PhD in ecopsychology. And then sort of fast forwarding through that, at the end of my PhD, I decided that, okay, so yes, I started facilitating those workshops. At the end of
Round circle.
the end of my PhD, I realised that I was really called to work with what you'd call more mainstream people in the community, because most of the workshops were kind of for people who were like already feeling deeply about what was happening to the planet.
Yeah.
You know, alternative types, activists. And I realised at the end of my PhD, and I'll talk about this later, is that actually we need to do this stuff somehow with everyone. So it means we have to kind of shift the subcultural context of this sort of fairly alternative stuff into a form that is more accessible to more people. And so that began like a 20-year period of working with my partner, Peter, in our environmental planning, design and education consultancy called Sustainable Futures Australia, and also working at university. So that sort of takes you up to date. And so at the end of that, it's like where I'm feeling really passionate about at the moment is working with and supporting young adults who are moving particularly like out of high school and into their next steps, recognizing what's happening to the world, but not actually knowing what to do about it or how to emotionally cope with the world that they're entering.
Well, I think you've given us plenty already to talk about, Eshana. I think with the things you've said, we could probably have a 40-minute discussion in and of itself. But I mean, just on that last part, I mean, I'll tie back and summarize a bit. But in terms of talking to young people, I saw a recent survey done by one of the NGOs locally here, and it showed that kids from the ages of 15 to 19, surveyed about 15,000 people, 1 in 4 felt extremely or very concerned about the climate crisis, which if you think just look 1 in 4, oh, okay, that's not too much, but that's like 25% of young kids. And that's only given the current state of the ecological crisis, which is looking at projections is going to get worse. So that number is only going to increase if you keep that in mind. And so I think it's very commendable, the work that your organization and yourself are doing. So I thank you for your service in this field. But to tie him back, I find it fascinating how you see that nature and the environment really is a place of solace, a place of connecting and feeling content in a world that it can be very chaotic and intense and all those human emotions that we feel. And at the same time, I found it very interesting how that also is where your area of study went into. And so I'd love to know a bit more about what actually is eco psychology and what is deep ecology as well, because you mentioned that those were two things that were quite, or deep ecology being quite pivotal, and eco psychology what you ended up studying. So can you help us understand what these fields are?
Sure. So deep ecology is most well known as a philosophy of nature, which really removes humans from being like the top of a supposed hierarchy, like the crown of creation, and acknowledges that we're just one strand in the web of life. Accompanying that, there is a movement, like a social movement, and experiential workshops, and a lot of people who are direct activists for the environment have a philosophy of deep ecology. So that's where it gets interesting and sort of people-ified. Some people in eco-psychology have described the deep ecology movement and workshop, experiential deep ecology, as eco-psychology. And in fact, so one of the roots of the movement of eco-psychology was very much from deep ecology. And so the term eco-psychology only came into being in the early to mid 1990s. And it really came out of a group of therapists in mainly California, but also on the East Coast of the US. And it was popularized by historian Theodore Roszak, who wrote a book called The Voice of the Earth. And he kind of catalyzed these groups of amazing people thinking similarly about that relationship between human health, particularly human mental health, and the health of the environment. And so it's like the symbiosis, the cross-fertilization of ecology and psychology, but very much sort of from a therapeutic perspective. So eco-psychologists, I would say, are really focusing on the reciprocity between ecology and people, and so the mental health of people in that way. John Seed, who is a deep ecologist and a rainforest activist, his definition of eco-psychology, when actually he and I took it to the Australian Psychological Association in the mid-90s. It was the first time it was kind of brought up in an Australian context, and he defined it as psychology in service of the earth. So not all eco-psychologists would agree with that definition, but I certainly would. And so being an eco-psychologist, our understanding of self is much more of a interdependent and systems understanding of self. So not just our interdependence with other human beings, but also with the more than human world. Whereas a more mainstream psychologist, I would say, is more influenced by the kind of philosophy of rugged individualism that is in our culture. And so essentially they're dealing with the skin encapsulated individual sort of ego and the health, of that. And so, that distinction is fairly stark, but I think it's, it's a good way to understand the difference between an eco-psychologist and a regular psychologist.
Absolutely. So if I was just to jump in and try and summarize that, so it places a very different context of the self in the self. So essentially in regular psychology, if I'm understanding you correctly, and please let me know if I've understood this, psychology looks at the self, and that is the context. We are looking to resolve one's individual problems, whereas eco-psychology looks at the self in the greater context of the environment, of biodiversity, of what life itself. And so you are a small piece in the web of life, and so those, I imagine, that context would inform the type of therapeutic initiatives that are sort of prescribed. Am I capturing that correctly?
You are, and so I think what you're talking about as well is like eco psychology as a therapy, which is often recurred. There's different forms. One's called ecotherapy, which is sort of where nature itself becomes the therapist in a way. So there's the healing aspects of being in nature, and that can be facilitated by an ecopsychologist. There's another form of therapy as well, which is like ecopsychotherapy. So it's actually psychotherapy, but going out into nature when you're doing like a more therapy session, so there's a huge variety of it. I mean, even forest bathing, I don't know whether you've heard of that. Yoku, that's a form of ecopsychology, ecotherapy. So there's a whole kind of range of things. But then there's also this idea of, as healthy humans, we need to be in healthy relationship with the natural environment, with the human community environment and the natural environment. And so ecopsychology also covers things like, okay, what motivates us to care for nature, and how can we deal with these scary and overwhelming feelings that we have about what's happening to the world. So it's quite vast. So it's everything from caring for the individual self within that larger context, right to the other extreme of caring for the earth because we're part of it,
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's a collection of ideas and concepts that are sort of injected into traditional mainstream psychology to make a more, like you said, systems approach to psychology in itself, which to me sounds very intuitive and almost I would think, well, I think psychology, in a sense, in its best form, all of it should be eco-psychology, because a lack of connection to the environment or a lack of understanding of yourself in the greater context of the universe is perhaps myopic, if I may make that value judgment.
Exactly. And that reminds me, I want to say that from a First Nations and Indigenous perspective, all psychology was eco-psychology, or all psychology is eco-psychology. So, and
absolutely,
and that also reminds me of the other meaning of eco-psychology that I've literally just been thinking about in the last few days, is the fact that the eco, in this context, we're talking about ecology and psychology. However, eco also means home. And so I believe that eco-psychology is actually in this kind of project to try and bring psychology home. As humans, like if you think about our history, 99% of all of our histories, not just Indigenous cultures and Indigenous people, but all of our history, 99% of it was living in what we now call wild nature as home. So, this is a radical, what we're living in now as so-called normal is such a radical departure from what we as beings actually are. No, I don't want to use the word design for, but, are,
We've evolved alongside nature, so we ought to consider that with a lot of intention.
Yes,
absolutely. And with that in mind, I mean, we've had a number of guests on, and we just actually spoke today with a professor of biology at Stanford, and we talked about biodiversity loss and all those sorts of things. And as per usual, it was very striking and saddening, and all another range of emotions, which I'm sure when people view that podcast will feel. But as like you said, as people, as a species that has evolved alongside nature, and yet we are seemingly the ones that are also responsible for a large percentage of what we're seeing. There's going to be all sorts of psychological impacts on people. And so I'd be interested to hear from you in terms of what are the impacts you are seeing from people as a result of the impacts on the natural world, or even being disconnected from the natural world.
Okay, so I'll start with our impacts on the natural world and how that's affecting us. So essentially, like our psychological responses to the ecological collapses, to climate change, our emotional responses can be sort of summarized underneath the term eco-anxiety. And this has ended up being used as an umbrella term. Other terms might be climate anxiety or eco-distress, or even earth emotions, pre-traumatic stress disorder. Like, there's a whole lot of terms. But essentially, eco-anxiety is a term that was first introduced quite a long time ago now by Sarah Ann Edwards and Linda Buzzell in California. And the most recent research on this is being done by Panu Pikala in Finland. Amazing. Like, he's just combining all of the research that's been done over the last decade, and it's wonderful stuff. But basically what's happening is that all these emotions, they, as you said before, they range from fear, like an underlying sort of anxiety, through to like periods of extreme fear, feelings of sorrow in the same way. They can just be sort of bubbling underneath the surface, or moments of extreme grief, feelings of anger, feelings of guilt, feelings of overwhelm. So there's this whole kind of melange of feelings that kind of overlap each other. And as you said, the research is showing, and some of the research that I've been doing as well is showing, that these feelings are getting more intense and also more widely held. So often, the people who feel these things are the people who actually know what's going on. So there's certain sort of subsections of the population, like, scientists, researchers, university students, who are kind of like up, they know what's going on. Other people that are affected greatly by these feelings are also people who experience other mental health distresses. So in other words, this sort of baseline kind of can put people over the edge in terms of other feelings. There's also, associated with this is also the mental health impacts and trauma from direct experience of climate-induced disasters or other ecological disasters. So whether that's floods or bushfires or droughts, so things like the destruction of people's homes, livelihoods, the ecological systems, their beloved places, all those sorts of things, that they're also, we're really starting to see those things now as the physical impacts of climate change kick in. And having said all of that, I just want to take a moment as well, just because I can feel myself getting really distressed about it, because it's really distressing. Like, this is real. And as you said, these impacts are getting worse, so our responses to them are getting worse. But I suppose, that is where some of the tools coming from ecopsychology are really relevant. Yeah. So maybe this is a good moment to actually switch across into some practice, because those feelings, as I said, are quite strong. So there's something from trauma psychology called the window of tolerance, which means that when we're faced with emotions that are too much, in a way, a bit overwhelming for our nervous systems, we can actually do some practices that bring it, that are like self-soothing or enlivening. So maybe let's just invite everyone to take a deep breath. You might just want to close your eyes if you feel comfortable doing that. And take a couple of deep breaths. And as you do that, pay attention to your feet on the floor beneath you. Put your feet on the floor and just imagine that your feet are connecting you down through the structure of the building down to the earth beneath you. And imagine in as much detail what that earth is like where you are. And just feel how the earth is always supporting you. No matter what you do, the earth's there beneath your feet. In this case, you're sitting on a chair probably. The earth through the chair is supporting you. And again, bring your attention back to your breath. And with each breath, see if you can feel sort of the inside of your body, your internal experience of your breathing. You might feel the cool air in your nostrils and feel that heating up as it goes into your lungs. And see if you can feel life breathing you. You're not doing much each time you breathe. In fact, you breathe even when you're unconscious, when you're asleep. Life continues to breathe you. And as you're doing this, you might even want to imagine and just recognize the fact that you're sharing your breath with the trees, with the oceans, that the carbon dioxide you breathe out is breathed in by these parts of life, the algae, the vegetation, and they breathe out the oxygen that we breathe in. And so when you're ready, just opening up your eyes and just, reflecting on if you're feeling any different from how you were a few minutes ago.
I feel much, much better. And I'm not just saying that. I really do feel, I mean, okay, so there's a little metaphor. So there's a book that I really like, I really enjoy, called The Art of Travel. And amongst the pages of the book, there's gaps. So there's just empty pages. And I think most 90% of people probably skip over the pages, as I did. But then at one time I chose not to and just chose to sit with what I just read. And I think a very similar experience here is taking a moment to really pause, which for all sorts of reasons in today's world is very challenging to do.
Yeah.
And so I thank you for that experiment and that that activity, and I'm hoping that others have done the same and felt rejuvenated, or I'm not too sure. Whatever you feel, whatever you feel.
But like you say, it's kind of a moment for digestion in a way. Like we're so used to, continuing on at fast speed, which of course is part of the problem, how we got it into the mess in the first place. But in a way, we need to, I think, be really aware. And this is as Nigerian psychologist Bayo Akomolafe says, how we see the climate change problem is part of the problem. So it's like just our standard ways of being, even if we're like applying them to, say, ecopsychology, we still need to be careful that we're not repeating the patterns that, that are part of our mainstream way of being that cause issues.
And sometimes the solutions itself doesn't require a radical change in the sense of new technologies, new innovations. perhaps it just requires a new way of seeing the same thing.
Yep.
So I think Proust has a good quote: "I don't need places to travel; I just need new eyes," or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
I see psychology exactly this way. And speaking from experience, if I may, there's a few years ago I started going to therapy, and if I'm speaking today, after doing a number of and being consistent with the practice, I've felt exactly that way, which is nothing in my life has necessarily changed radically except how I view things.
Yes.
And for me, this has been transformative, really. And I was saying to my partner the other day that it's in a way provided me a new lenses, new glasses, as if I'm putting on a new pair of glasses and I'm seeing the world completely differently. And so,
Absolutely. And can I ask you a question there?
yeah, of
Because
course.
it's like, with that new view, though, you say that your life hasn't changed significantly, but do you think that it's somehow that new view has actually opened up new opportunities for you, or
Yeah,
made new things possible?
yeah, absolutely. And so when I say nothing's changed radically, I don't mean to say that I didn't have to undergo I didn't need to move to a different country to feel better,
Mm.
or I didn't need to finally get the job I wanted, or there wasn't a radical change per se, but the way I saw the world change, and
Yes.
consequently my life is much better as a result of that. And I think that's obviously the point of therapy. Um, but as a result of seeing things in a new way, I've been able to come up with strategies that actually align with what I want. And so I think using that in the context of climate, which I really enjoy the metaphor that we're on at the moment. Well, what's missing in the climate discourse?
So I think what you were saying about so much of the climate discourse and the so-called solutions are like technological solutions. And if they're not technological, those technological solutions don't even really require us to change our behaviors much. We just sort of
Hmm.
buy different things, um, or even if we do actually need to change our behaviors, we certainly don't need to change our mindset. And
Hmm.
so I think so in the mainstream sort of climate discourse that, there's things like in 2015, you've got the UN developed the SDGs, so the Global Sustainable Development Goals
Hmm.
that are being used around the world, right? So there's been a kind of big uptake in terms of excitement that they could be useful and they're being applied. However, there's not a lot of like progress actually being made in terms of reducing our impacts on the planet or making positive impacts. So I think, and I've only just recently discovered this, that there's actually now a movement for IDGs, which are inner development goals, to help accelerate the progress of the SDGs. So I think this is where ecopsychology can really help with this. So it really is developing a whole lot of different skills, which again, I feel like they're skills that traditionally as human beings over many, many thousands of years we had, but it's like we've lost a lot of them in this sort of capitalist, colonial, overculture of consumption and everything. So it's about, re-establishing and regrowing, regenerating these ways of being. And one of those things, I think, is another question you want to ask me, which is about
Yes.
how we can actually develop a more sustainable relationship with the natural
Hmm.
world, and
Yeah.
how
And how can we do that?
I feel like there's three different aspects of this. The first one is to heal our false sense of disconnection from nature. And so this is where deep ecology comes in. So I'll repeat that: healing our false sense of disconnection from nature, because of course we are absolutely interconnected with nature, but in our culture we behave as if we're not. We behave as if humans and nature are quite distinct, and that the whole human world can exist quite independently of what's going on with nature, which is just a total fallacy. But our whole overculture is based on this.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that one point, in my conversation this morning with Professor Rodolfo of biology, we were discussing biological diversity, and he was mentioning food being a biological that if food systems collapse, for example, or if there's a lack of diversity, the amount of food that we have will drastically decrease, basically calling food and the range of food we have is a result of biological diversity, which in that context, for some reason it just never really clicked, but it became very apparent that the food system is the nature, and by destroying nature, we're in consequence destroying our potential livelihoods. We're sawing off the limb on which we stand, so to speak.
Yep, absolutely. Well put. And this is where the deep ecological concept of ecological self or ecological identity comes in, is that there is absolutely no meaningful separation between nature out there and the nature in here. So we are, from a deep ecology perspective, we are nature. And what we need to do is practices to help us recognize that. And so there's many exercises to and processes in order to do that. But I also want to, and this is where ecopsychology comes in compared to deep ecology, is that yes, I agree, we are nature, but we are also human. Like, we're a specific sort of manifestation of nature that has particular qualities. And so we can't just sort of imaginarily like dissolve ourselves into nature and just become one with it. We actually also need to recognize that nature is an other, like it's an other to be respected and enter into healthy relationship with. So we need to understand nature and have a very humble relationship with the more than human world. And as in so many Indigenous psychologies, like I've been reading some of Tyson Younger Porter and with Santalk and Robin Wall Kimmerer braiding sweetgrass, they just articulate that humility and understanding that we as human beings are kind of like the younger cousins or brothers or sisters of the more than human world. Like, we actually know less than these other life forms that have been on the planet for a lot longer than us, so we need to learn from them. So anyway, so there's a bit of a rave there.
Yeah. And I think just to complement that, as I understand, the average mammalian species lasts about, I think, 1 million years roughly, if I'm understanding that correctly, and humans have only been around 200 to 300,000 years, or Homo sapiens, I should say. And so I think that exemplifies what you're saying, that in the scale of deep geological time, we are mere specks in the whole scheme of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet I think we have this, and maybe I'm wrong here, maybe other life forms experience this too, but we do have this particular ability to be conscious of that and to, and even with, not just our old cultures, but our new scientific ways of seeing. It's like we can also see the existence of that scale of space and time in a way that possibly other creatures cannot.
We're discussing how ecopsychology can help us develop a more sustainable relationship with the natural world, and you were talking about eliminating or healing our false sense of disconnection with nature, and one way of doing that is the idea of the ecological self. And I think you mentioned there were 2 others that you were mentioning.
Yeah. So the second one that I want to talk about is how ecopsychology can also provide support, nurture and healing from eco-anxiety and climate distress, so that even though from the perspective of ecopsychology, eco-anxiety is seen as a healthy response to an unhealthy world. So a regular psychologist might see it as being pathological, like unrealistic anxiety or something like that. But an eco psychology says it's a healthy response to an unhealthy world. But it doesn't mean that sometimes the strength of those feelings aren't overwhelming or debilitating. In fact, they can actually cause paralysis, and you can't, the feelings are so strong that it's really hard to take action. So ecopsychology has a lot of tools to help transmute those feelings into positive action, and even ameliorate them to the extent that they're handleable. And I think my personal opinion is that some level of eco anxiety is actually really important for everybody to have. Like, it's actually a realistic response to what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So by actually engaging with it, it provides us with information and feedback as to what's happening in the ecological and the climate systems of which we are a part. So we need to be feeling those feelings, but we also need to support each other in order to cope with those feelings, and use them for action. So that's Absolutely. The second one. And then the third, I think, key value of ecopsychology is that, particularly through a whole lot of research that's been done, is that it helps us understand how inner psychological change, how behavioural change and social change actually happens. And so that enables us to design and implement more effective environmental campaigns, and feelings of empowerment for change makers. It's so important that we support the people who are really doing a lot of work in this field to address climate change and ecological collapse. So that's, I think, the third key aspect of ecopsychology.
Yeah, fascinating. I think, we can dive into each one of them in a bit more detail, but I think one that for me is I would like to press on a bit is the number 2. So you mentioned the idea of engaging with the eco-anxiety and saying that there is some merit, or there is value, I should say, in engaging with the feeling and validating it in a sense, and saying that, yes, it doesn't feel quite nice, and yet it's a proportionate response to a huge problem. Mm-hmm. And given the complexity of it, it's hard to engage and resolve the problem as you probably would with any other personal problem in your life in a effective way. And so I think for a lot of people, and perhaps I'll just go on a quick anecdote. I think maybe there's an idea that engaging in these feelings may not be that helpful. And I think, personally speaking, I've because of my experiences in therapy, I've learned to engage with my negative feelings in a way I think is helpful most of the time, and not always perfect. But when it comes to climate change, for some reason, I never did that. And so I think recently in December, I read a book by an Australian climate scientist called Joelle Gergis, called Humanity's Moment. And she was a leading IPCC author, and she essentially just summarizes the research in her book. And I've always processed climate change research on a very heady level intellectually. Okay, this is not great. Whatever. Very robotic, Spock-like. Like, okay, yeah, this is not great. We got to reduce our emissions, whatever. But in that, after reading that book, I just started crying. Well, in moments rather. But I felt very relieved, and also. It was cathartic, I think, one point. But also it made me feel a sort of sense of progress, as if I'd sort of discovered something. I don't know. I don't. It was a bit of a strange moment, but I felt very. It made me feel I could put up a better challenge to the climate crisis and the ecological crisis. It's very hard for me to put my finger on, but it felt really good.
Yes.
So how can we grieve through the Anthropocene, or what advice would you have for people engaging with these negative feelings?
Yep. So there's so much in that anecdote that I kind of want to talk about as well.
Sure, sure.
So if I can just take some elements of it, is that the first one you talk about actually that your habitual response to this material is to intellectually, analyze it and stay in your head. And I think that that science is based on that, right? So much of our mainstream Western culture is that rationality, the intellect, is really valued and respected above feelings and the irrational, especially when dealing with problems. It's like we collectively try to seek, in inverted commas, rational solutions and things like that. So it's basically just the way that our society deals with problems, So the thing is that from the perspective of like trauma psychology, and so I was literally listening to a presentation by the German mystic and collective trauma psychologist Thomas Heubel last night, and he was basically saying that the problem is from that perspective of trauma, going into the intellect is literally a trauma response because we're leaving our body and our emotions. And so that essentially it's a trauma response because we're protecting ourselves, right? We're dissociating from the enormity of the experience. And actually by doing that movement into the intellect is kind of what's been enabled us to create the harm that we've done. Like if over time we actually stayed with our hearts and our bodies, our feelings, we wouldn't have been able to enact the level of destruction, that we have.
Sure.
So, in a sense, the solution to climate change and the ecological crisis is actually requiring like a wholehearted, embodied human response to what's going on. And that is it's really not common in our society to do that. So I just want to pause there for a moment to
Yep. Big deep breaths. Yep.
So it's not normal to be wholehearted embodied humans when we're facing big problems in our Western society. However, it has been, I believe, normal for most of our 99% of our human history. So again, we've got to reclaim these abilities, which are, I believe, recorded in every cell of our being. So that I believe, I'm quite optimistic about us being able to kind of bring them back. So the next thing that I want to say as well is that it's a very admirable thing that you've been able to do, and it's probably partly to do with the fact that you have been doing therapy. So as you said, you're experienced at being with your so-called negative or difficult emotions. So, but in general, it's like I don't think we're designed to do grief or strong negative emotions alone. We actually need to support each other. And so one way that our society has done that is to sort of outsource it to the professional psychologists, the therapists, help us with it, which is great. And those people are really skilled, so better use them. However, I believe that these skills are actually very much part of our human beingness, and that we can literally educate ourselves. I'm a big believer in psychoeducation, where the therapists and people who know this stuff are able to explain it in such a way that we can support each other. We can support each other with these difficult feelings. So I believe that there's kind of three different ways that we can go with this. One is, like you did, to practice our own personal practice. So things like meditation, yoga, movement, journaling, things like that. We can do all of these things as an individual to build our resilience and nurturing and the space that can hold these feelings. Secondly, we can support each other individually, like reach out to, friends, loved ones, do the classic, are you okay? Ask for support, all those sorts of things. So choose well in terms of who you reach out to, in terms of it's someone that you pretty much trust, that they know and support you and can handle some big emotions. But then the third practice, and I think this is what is so important, is like that this is something that we do in community. And so I don't know if you've heard of Joanna Macy, who's
No.
heard of her? So a Buddhist scholar, but an activist going back in, like, she's still alive. She's 90 something. She started her activism in the 1950s, anti-nuclear activism, part of a movement called Despair and Empowerment. So sort of grieving rituals that we do together that provide a really strong container of a group of people who will actually listen to each other's feelings of deep grief or eco-anxiety, whatever you want to call it, and literally just honor the pain that people are feeling. And through these processes, so there's a particular ritual called the Truth Mandala, or a new form of it that I practice called Dare to Care from the Joyality Project, where essentially we're through honouring our pain and supporting each other, we end up, as you say, there's that cathartic experiences of the release of the emotions. So that feels good, but also we realize that through sharing our anger, our fear, our guilt, our overwhelm, that by sharing them in this context, something almost magical happens where we're actually putting to contact with the flip side of those feelings. So, for example, the flip side of grief and sorrow actually being love. Like, we don't feel those feelings of grief and sorrow unless it's about something that we love and care for. The anger is actually a form of like passion for justice. Feeling guilt and shame actually enables us to, the flip side of that, interestingly enough, is like a sense of humility. And
yeah, right.
amends. So each of these difficult feelings have within them a seed of a positive feeling and emotion. And so by going through these rituals, we actually, not only do we realize that we're not alone, that we're all in this together, but there's actually a nurturing element within each one of those difficult feelings. So very powerful work. There's a lot of work that reconnects. Our program, the Joyality Project program, Frances Weller's, I'm just reading at the moment this fantastic book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frances Weller. Grief rituals. So anyway, it's really emerging now as a very important tool, I think, as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may just try and summarize what I've just heard. So, I mean, jumping back to right at the beginning, what you were saying, the practice of, the habit of perhaps intellectualizing very difficult things in one way can be perceived as a trauma response, which I find very amusing. And I think of many things about that. But yeah, I can definitely see how that could definitely be the case, especially with, I was a bit skeptical when I first heard of it. I heard you say that, but then when considering the scale of the problem like climate change, it seems farcical to think that you wouldn't feel any other way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then secondly, to try and feel what we're feeling in a group setting, because that is how we evolved. We've evolved to not only be in groups, but we've evolved to process feelings, emotions, all sorts of things in group settings. And so to try and do so in any other way is perhaps not working in your best interests, or perhaps slowing the progress at which you could grieve, in a sense, or feel whatever it is you're feeling. And
And
then
it's harder.
lastly,
It's more
yeah,
difficult. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. And then I think lastly, you mentioned honoring the feeling, which to me definitely rings true in terms of trying to how I think about it is viewing your emotions in a way of viewing your emotions as a sort of compass. And this is what I've sort of done. So what I mean by that, and this could be, perhaps it's silly, but when I feel something, I previously would lean away from it because
Yes.
it was not very comfortable. But now I've sort of done the opposite, which is lean into it and
Perfect.
actually begin to wonder, I'm feeling this way for a very particular reason. And so I should try and figure it out, what's going on here. And so that's how I sort of viewed the third part you mentioned about honoring the feeling and really giving it its due and being respectfully curious.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like
Yeah.
being welcoming each of the feelings, like you're a host to these
Mm,
feelings in your house,
yeah,
in your heart,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. And I think one way to put what I'm saying in a much more eloquent way is Professor Timothy Morton, who is very eccentric and interesting, and I very much like his work. And he says that emotions are messages from the future, which I very much like, because when you're experiencing an emotion in the moment, such as climate anxiety, perhaps if you've not understood it, perhaps in the moment when you feel it, you may not understand it. Why am I feeling this way? I'm not quite sure. And it is only with time that you come to understand, that's it. That's why I felt that way. And so I like thinking about it in that way. But
Very
nevertheless,
interesting.
I digress. But I think as a last point, Ishana, I mentioned Timothy Morton. He also has another idea which I've toyed with, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I'll pose it to you. So he came up with a word called EcoPath. Substituting a psycho or a sociopath with ecopath, and basically the idea of someone who acts with indifference to environmental catastrophe. And I would argue, based on the definition he's provided, that in a sense a lot of us are ecopaths because of the way that we are acting. And perhaps I wouldn't be so critical. Perhaps those who are knowingly and have an active role in the climate crisis, such as people sitting on the boards of oil companies and know exactly what they're doing. But nevertheless, I think it's quite a interesting idea. What are your thoughts, if you have any?
Well, I think if you look on the level of behaviour, then I definitely agree with you. And yes, the majority of us living in the wealthy Western world, we are acting like ecopaths. But as a something sort of like psychological, as in a that sort of term has a really I don't know, sort of scary, judgmental kind of, feeling about it, like
Of
that
course.
someone might be labeled an ecopath. And so I've got to say that in that sense, I have never met one. So with all the research that I've done and with my
Right.
couple of decades working, with wide ranges of people in community, with government departments, industries like logging and mining, that I don't believe that I've actually met an ecopath. Um, Not to say that they don't exist, but I think that it's more like the systems that we are held within. So whether that's capitalism, consumerism, patriarchy, extractivism, that's the real ecopath. And maybe there might be some individuals who are very high up in that kind of system that might be, really feeling that way, that they don't care about the natural world, the future, and things like that. However, I think it would be very rare. Certainly my research doing with my PhD, and I was trying to interview as wide a range of people as possible because I was trying to find people actually who didn't care about nature. And what I discovered was that if you ask the right questions, if you actually get people really reflecting on what's important to them, then basically everybody that I've talked to does have a deep care for nature and for the future, even if they're for different reasons. So, yeah.
Well, I must say I'm very pleased to hear that. And I suppose this is a good way to wrap up with the final question, which we ask all of our guests. And it's an exercise of imagination, so to speak, and you can say it in as few or as many words as you like. I'd like to ask you, what is your utopia? What does your utopia look like?
Oh, so my utopia looks like people from all walks of life living in a healthy relationship with the land, with the country, with each other, living very simply so that the resources that we're using at the moment are like we just use so much less than that, and that everybody is like actively conscious and engaged in trying to make the world a better place. It sounds trite, but just that sense of intention and positivity, which I actually believe brings great joy to everyone living in that way.
Well, I think I couldn't have said it any better. I think it's a great way to end it. Please stay with me in the green room, Eshana, but thank you very much for your time and your thoughtful words and your deep consideration for everyone, the environment, and everything within it. So thank you very much. Is there if you would like to refer people to any resources that you have or any initiatives that you have going on, please feel free to tell the people where they can find it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Xavier. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed your questions. So I think that the two places that I'd like to refer people are both to the Jagira Eco Community Project that we're putting together. We're actively looking for people who actually want to live that sort of utopia that I was just describing. And so the website is ecocommunity.org.au. And then secondly is the Joyality Project, which essentially is like applied ecopsychology for personal and planetary well-being. So empowering conscious change makers. So there's lots of resources there. We run trainings regularly, online and in-person immersions and things like that. And the website is www.joyality.org. So look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you again, Eshana.